Everything that's old is new again. Who's one of the hottest bands right now? Knock Loose, a hardcore band. New metal's back. Emo's making a comeback. Limp Bizkit's on a nostalgia tour. There's a death metal renaissance going on right now. All the old stuff is popular again. Metal is in a nostalgia trip at the moment. We are on the other end of the cycle turning, and all the old forms of music are becoming popular again. But why? Why is this happening? Well, when you have questions of why in society, then it's time to bring in the philosophers. So I brought in my good friend David Burke, who is a PhD candidate in metal studies. Yes, let's bring in a man who's actually studying these things, and let's try to figure this out. David Burke, welcome back to the show. I need your expertise. I've been noticing this trend going on in rock and metal, and I can't quite put it into words, so I figure I'd call in the big guns, the heavy hitter.
Thanks very much.
Basically, what I'm looking at is a resurgence of the past. So I read this book a while back called The Fourth Turning, and the basic premise of the book is time is not linear like we think it is. It's not this ever forward march of progress. There's actually cycles to history, like the four seasons. And now I'm sort of seeing that in music as well. So I talked earlier in previous podcasts how I think that metalcore is going in two different directions. I'm seeing bands go in more of a new metal, Deftones, Linkin Park, and also like a poppy direction. Oddly enough, a little bit of cyberpunk influence in there too. And then the other direction I'm seeing metalcore bands go is hardcore. Just lots of great hardcore bands like Turnstile and Knock Loose and Jesus Peace really blowing up right now. Knock Loose just played Coachella. And, not only did they play this massive pop festival, but the people in the audience knew the words. And then in our realm, in the extreme metal genre, we're seeing this renaissance in death metal and even new glam metal bands coming out. Like I see a glam metal band and I noticed that the members of the band are 20 and I'm like, what? And Finn McKenty keeps saying that he only gets views when he talks about like millennial butt rock bands.
Basically, what I used to talk a lot more like newer artists and stuff like that back in, say, 2018, 2019, even maybe like 2020. But what I realized is that whenever I talked about something new, it would get lower views and negative comments. And whenever I talked about anything other than basically like millennial rock guitar music, people didn't like it. They got mad.
Bands that he went to high school listening to, nothing else gets views. And I just wonder what you make of this, I don't know, this longing for the past that I'm seeing in music right now.
Let's look at what's on Loudwire. We've got Creed, Guns N' Roses, Linkin Park, Slipknot, Van Halen, Allman Brothers, Iron Maiden, 90s rock songs. It's all this like basically retro stuff because that's the only thing that rock audiences will accept is basically all this nostalgia content.
So there's a couple of things that come off there for me. The first is that metal has these kind of cycles in and out of popularity. In the early 70s, when like Sabbath and Deep Purple were like international, huge rock bands, that was the first time it was popular. And then through the mid 70s and late 70s, it kind of rolls off. People are less interested. Punk sort of hoves into view. But then in the mid 80s, and certainly after MTV is founded starts in 1981. Metal gradually moves back into the mainstream. Then, at the beginning of the 90s, it gets pushed out again by grunge. And then, towards the end of that decade, it comes back. Now, in the early 2000s, metal was sort of popular in some ways, but largely through metalcore and emo, which a lot of true metal fans at the time really didn't like and disparaged as this isn't proper. Kind of in the same way, I guess, that they would have talked about new metal in the 90s or glam metal in the 80s. There's this division between the true fans and the fans of this popified version of the style.
Hey,
And
on
what we
that,
yeah.
sorry to interrupt. On that note, what do you think about this? Because I always find this interesting. Like you said, glam metal was considered not the true metal by the underground back in that day, and then of course new metal. Well, now Limp Bizkit is touring again, and people are acting like they never hated Limp Bizkit.
Hmm.
There's this sort of nostalgia glasses, and there's this emo tour. I think it was something to the effect of When We Were Young. It's all the like My Chemical Romance bands, and now people are older and they're looking back at that. Yeah, yeah, I liked My Chemical Romance. It's like, I don't remember that you did.
Hmm. Hmm. I mean, so the thing I was trying to I was getting to there is like we're now in this kind of fourth or kind of maybe fourth or fifth period where metal has had significant commercial popularity. But this time around, not only have we got the previous generations worth of metal to nostalgia about, like yeah, new metal and like 2000s metalcore and emo, but also there's a further generation behind that. Like there's the 80s glam generation behind it. So we're now at the stage where there's several successive generations of nostalgia, people continually looking back. Because remember, in the early 2000s, there was a glam metal revival then too. Like this is actually the second time that we've had a glam revival now, and uh, and the thing that you're pointing out there, where like some fans that may not have liked, may not have said they liked it at the time, are now swept up by the prospect of seeing Limp Bizkit play live. Like, I think it says something really interesting about how metal ages, because like each generation thinks of the music that it falls in love with, and this is not just a metal thing. This happens to everybody in popular music. We all think that our generation is the meaningful one, is the important thing, is the groundbreaking experience, and then that passes us by. But I guess the difference in metal is that there's this cultural focus on staying within the spaces and having and continuing the practices well into adulthood, where some other musical cultures, people don't stick around quite in the same way. I think normally of like dance and rave culture for this, because like past a certain point you can't stick around going to raves all the time. It just doesn't work for most people's bodies. But metal has this kind of aging fan base. There's loads of us now in our 70s even and older. And perhaps that core, as the context that people grow up in, as they pass out of those, where, for instance, you might get bullied or told that you're weak for listening to Limp Bizkit. 20 years down the line, that becomes a possibility, but it's also a weird possibility, right? Because you're not actually seeing it with the energy that it had at the time, and maybe you felt that it had at the time. Rather, you're seeing this like, or not a tribute band, obviously, like they're still the real thing, but like it's not them at their peak. You're not
They're a
going to see.
legacy act now.
That's
Yeah.
exactly it.
You talking about people can't stay in other genres. I think a good illustration of that, metal fashion stays the same. It,
Yeah, it's pretty
if you
consistent.
if you were a metalhead in the 80s and you wore your denim battle vest, and that's what you still wear now.
Hmm.
But if you were a pop fan in the 80s, you're not wearing, tight rolls and members only jackets anymore. You don't stay in that mode for the rest of your life. Metal's really the only culture musically that you stay the same basically your whole life.
Yeah, I agree. The aesthetic is really consistent. Um, and and also as I say, some of the practices around it also kind of keep you present. Like the high participation rate means that that people who are in their 40s or 50s are still going to be in contact with younger bands, right? Because they'll be playing with them occasionally at shows. So there's more a sense of passing the baton on as well, of like older bands almost like being able to interact with younger musicians, give them little pieces of advice, little bits of mentoring, that kind. Not like formally, but like that sort of practice is more common. It's encouraged by the idea that the best thing you can do in metal culture is to have a band.
Hmm. Do you think that that happens in a different way in metalcore culture? Because I've noticed that there's a lot that goes on in metalcore that
Mm,
I am completely unaware of. So
right.
I've
Okay.
done this series, Death Metal Fan Discovers Metalcore, because I keep finding these bands and then I look them up and I'm like, holy shit, this band is huge. And they kind of tour together. You know, death metal bands will tour with thrash bands, will tour with black metal bands, but they don't really tour with metalcore bands. Metalcore bands, they have their own thing that they tour with. Their
Mm,
aesthetic is different. So
hmm
I did an episode where in the same week I did concert photography for Septic Flesh, Decapitated, bands like that. And then a couple of days later, I went to a metalcore show and photographed Era and Make Them Suffer. And you know, on the one hand, you got the classic metal look, black pants, battle vest, goth chicks. And at the metalcore show, everybody's just in regular street clothes. If I didn't hear the music, I would have thought I was in a regular
mm.
nightclub. It looks like a completely different thing going off to the side.
Yeah, sure. And metalcore's a really interesting thing, right? Because musically, a lot of it is as loud or as heavy as a lot of extreme metal. And a lot of the metalcore fans definitely say that they're inspired by extreme metal bands, and you can read the influences all over their work. But it scenically it occupies this unwanted position. Like lots of true metal fans and people in the extreme metal scene don't like metalcore and don't want it, and that has been a cultural constant since the early 2000s, definitely, maybe even a bit before that. Like as soon as, and certainly as soon as breakdowns became like an identifiable part of the metalcore musical vocabulary, as around about the same time that happens is when extreme metal fans decide that it's not actually proper and they don't really want it in their spaces. So you then get what you've described, like a parallel music, like a parallel economy and a parallel culture where they're clearly really similar, but there's much less interaction between the groups than between, say, death metal fans and thrash metal fans, or death metal fans even and black metal fans, because they share the same space of, oh well, it's all extreme metal. This is all the stuff that nobody wants to listen to apart from us. Whereas metalcore, and certainly the kind of metalcore that became really popular in the late 2000s onwards, is aimed at a much bigger audience. And there's also from the extreme metal fans, you get this resentment because it's like, oh, you're trying to make something that's a bit commercial, and that doesn't really go with the either the outsider ethos or the DIY ethos that people often cite in those scenes.
Hmm.
So, but in a broader sense, and the thing you were talking about, like how they dress, this reminds me of a book that I read recently about the kind of the complex interactions that metal and punk have. And these two kind of impulses, the punk impulse based on like music got the right ideas, the right ethics, versus metal, which the impulse is more about the way he characterizes it in this book, and he's talking about 70s and 80s stuff. He says that metal is more geared towards the arena, is more about reaching a big audience by offering them a grand spectacle, like Alice Cooper. Whereas punk is much more about performing the right kind of ethics and the right kind of values through a performance that isn't about giving people a really big show. It's about actually the opposite of that. It's about showing like you don't care that you're giving them a big show or challenging the conventions of performance. Now, what I want to suggest here is that extreme metal and metalcore actually present an inversion of this. It is extreme metal, it is death metal with like the camo shorts and the not offering a particularly engrossing stage experience, and death metal and black metal's kind of adherence to like DIY ethos and independent labels and all that kind of thing. Extreme metal is more like punk, and metalcore is more like what metal was in the 70s and 80s, where it's about trying to reach a really big audience and give them a high quality night of entertainment through, arguably, through the form of the breakdown, this thing that encourages mosh pits and encourages the fun aspects of going to a metal show. Whereas, when you go to a death metal or a black metal show, yeah, there might be some pitting, but you're also going to see a lot of people stood there
Yeah.
just kind of taking it in, maybe counting the bars almost, like thinking about how the music is put together. But that, in a way, is closer in some regards to what punk started out as trying to embody.
And the interesting thing there too is punk sort of grew up as well. Many decades of punk and it stayed underground. And then in the 90s, you get pop punk. And it's got this explosion of popularity. It's all you see on MTV. It's all you hear on the radio. And it's less about being a part of a scene. The bands become more national.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
even punk wasn't immune to that commercial infiltration.
Yeah, though the interesting thing there is when metal has its moments of commercial prominence, the style continues to build on top of previous generations of metal fashion and aesthetics, like we said before. Like gradually things change in metal. Like the long sleeve didn't used to be a part of metal fashion, but then that gets added. But it's only one item. For instance, there are only a few things that get added. And it's gradual. It takes a little bit of time. In the 90s, now it's okay to have a wallet chain. We didn't have wallet chains. People only invented wallet chains in 1989, so we didn't have them before then. But whereas punk, like the thing as when punk comes in and out of popularity, because it has a similar kind of thing, like pop punk is the popular version of punk in the 90s, but then there's also still loads of scene stuff happening, like crust gets really big in the 90s, like you got bands like Leftover Crack, and Anarcho had a kind of moment alongside grindcore. You got bands like Earth Crisis and that kind of thing. So that but pop punk has this style which is kind of like 70s punk, but also kind of its own thing, more laid back, more fun, less confrontational. And now the punk that is in vogue, like bands like Turnstile, or in the UK, there's a band called Idols who are really big, and they are the kind of current inheritor to the biggest punk band in the country. These guys don't dress like punks from the 70s or from the 80s or from the 90s. They dress like people that go to craft ale bars, actually.
Mm.
They dress kind of regular. Like they've got nice facial hair, perhaps, like it's actually groomed. Um like it's not just all over the place. And they wear like earthy tones. It's what we see in punk, perhaps, is how when punk tries to break out or try and get into the mainstream, it moves a lot more with fashion because and it responds to the politics of its moment. You know, each little successive part of punk that calls itself punk is historically responding to a different set of politics because punk is fundamentally about, I think it's fundamentally about trying to articulate politics through music. Whereas metal, each time it comes back into popularity, little things have changed, but the overall core center of it is still all black, it's still all long hair, and you still play big riffs on an electric guitar, you know?
Yeah, punk is always about society. Even the really polished pop punk, it might be about high school society or whatever, but it's always about society.
Hmm,
Whereas
that's it.
metal can be about society, but it can also be about dragons and wizards or space monsters or whatever. So it doesn't have this rule. But I'm glad you brought up Earth Crisis and Turnstile because that brings me back to hardcore. So, for instance, Knock Loose, their lead singer on this current tour supporting their new album, is wearing a white button up, just a plain white button up on stage. He looks like he may have been a Mormon missionary and he's done with his day of knocking on doors. So he took his tie off and he untucks his white shirt and then he goes and does hard, hardcore on stage. I mean, some of the hardest stuff I've heard this year.
Mm.
And I'm wondering if this isn't the popularity of Knock Loose. Like, I don't think they made a calculated decision. I think they're making the music that they want to make. But the popularity, the response of the audience, I wonder if it isn't because metalcore has been so polished for so long. You know, after the gent movement, electronics started to come in, a lot of pop influences, especially Asian pop influences, and it got so glossy. And now here's this hardcore band just playing
Mm.
guitars, and screaming. And I just wonder if maybe this isn't like some reactionary response from the audience, and that's why hardcore is so popular again.
Yeah, sure. I think the thing maybe to get here is that like every genre perhaps has this tension within it, like you were talking about before, like bands that go more poppy and more slick versus bands that go more raw and less pop and less about being as I say, like the dynamic that this guy in this book articulates is really good because it's basically the difference between wanting to play to a big room and wanting to play to a small room. Like the big room style involves trying to give everybody a really great show for that evening. You know, give them a night's worth of entertainment, a spectacle. You know, whereas small room mindset, as it were, is more about, well, it's not about trying to reach everybody. It's about trying to reach the people who matter. You know, the relevant and particular audience that is gonna get it, not the masses who maybe don't get it in the same way.
Hmm.
And what we're seeing perhaps in metalcore is a division within itself based on these two kinds of directions, right? Like we've seen that in loads of different metal discourses before. Like after all of the influential second wave black metal bands, for instance, you get this really clear division between the bands that want to go more symphonic and try and make records that maybe people listen to, and those that want to make it rawer and rawer and more unlistenable, you know? Like you're also, I think, seeing it at the moment in death metal revival, right? Like there are some bands that are taking it to new extremes of harshness, meaning and like or even perhaps maybe the way to characterize this is like in death metal, slam is more about playing to big rooms. Slam is well produced, good to dance to, fun, stupid in a fun way, and so on. Whereas bands like Blood Incantation are doing death metal revival in a very different way. They're trying to make it more artful and complicated, and that's for small rooms of people that do this, not big rooms of people that want to dance about.
Mm. The last episode of the podcast was I compared Metallica fans with Star Wars fans. And my basic premise was whatever entry point you had into the respective art. So if you were an old head, you got in around Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets. That's the best. And this touches on that point you made earlier on about whatever generation you're from, that's the most relevant. Where somebody that came in at the Black Album, is going, that's Metallica to them. Same with Star Wars. People that saw A New Hope in the theaters, that's Star Wars. And the kids that grew up on the Clone Wars on Disney Channel, to them, that's Star Wars.
But maybe I want to add something there as well to link it to the nostalgia thing, is that in the past, when we didn't have the internet, what you're describing is definitely true. But maybe now, with the ability to access all of Metallica's albums at a stroke, maybe that changes how people relate to these bands, right? Like you're gonna get like, remember when a couple of years ago when they had that thing on Stranger Things, they had a Metallica reference. So maybe a whole load of kids are getting into Metallica via the first four albums now, because they know that that's, they're able to go on the internet, read all the journalism, read all the people like you and me arguing over which Metallica album is best on the internet, and so on, and come away with like being very differently informed to how people that grew up listening, like watching Enter Sandman on MTV, would have experienced it. Like maybe that affects how this nostalgia is so long lasting after the development of the internet compared to how it was before. Like now the nostalgia is all pervasive, and it feels like these old bands just don't go anywhere. They never break up. They stay on, continuing to soak up this legacy audience. And what we're discovering as we go on is that even bands that we thought at the time, who cares about these guys? This is terrible. Even they can find a nostalgic audience, whether that's
Yes.
Limp Bizkit or My Chemical Romance or whatever part of metal that was not critically acclaimed at the time, whichever that one is. Presumably, of course, in the future, we have to look forward to like, oh God, I'm trying to think of a good example right now. Yeah, like, oh yeah, that would be good. A baby metal reunion tour,
Yeah.
but they're all like 35 metal anymore. It'll just be adult metal.
That's an interesting point too
But
about
we
the
have
internet,
to,
because now those kids that discovered Metallica through Stranger Things, when they go to look for Metallica, they're going to be immediately exposed to the heterodox opinion. The liturgy is already written for Metallica fandom. It's the first four albums, and everything else sucks. Whereas I didn't get that. When I got into Metallica, I heard one on MTV one night, and that Machine Gun riff changed my life. And then the Black Album dropped, and there was nobody around me to say, these albums suck. You got the original albums are the only, nobody told me that until many years later. So I was free to enjoy Load and Reload without my opinion being influenced in that way. Whereas kids now cannot do that.
no, no, exactly. And as I say, it means that, like, in a way, the internet means that our history never fully goes away. And on the one hand, this is good because it means that we get to feel like we can keep writing it, that the arguments and discussions that people have about what album is good or not, they last on social media. We get to literally read forums and read what other people 10, 20 years ago, where that would have been impossible in the past, completely unthinkable. But on the other hand, the problem with history not going away does go away, and the new seems like it never comes. And what instead we're presented with, and where all the money goes, I think most importantly, is towards constantly regurgitating the bands that people liked roughly 20 years, 20 or that those people that were 20 are now 40 and have stable jobs so that they can afford to go to these gigs and pay over the odds for merchandise.
That's the Finn McKenty point. He can't talk about new music. His audience only wants to hear about the bands they listened to in high school. I, but it can't be. That's why I can't wrap my head around it. It can't be that 40-year-old dudes are driving the scene. Because if that's the case, that's a bad diagnosis for the health of the scene.
Yeah, I think it's a time and a place, right? On the one hand, yes, in the commercially viable end of metal music and of popular music generally, all we're seeing is nostalgia. All we're seeing is let's just go back to 20 years ago because that's a known quantity. In the same way that movies are largely remakes or extensions of franchises these days because they're safe bets. On the other hand, come on, the scene is on the level of extreme metal and like the underground. It's clearly in some ways never been. It's so now because the tech is cheaper, easier for us to distribute it. So in some ways, it's never been better, but also, yeah, in some ways, it's never been worse. And
Mm.
that's definitely the weird thing about it, right?
Great point. That reminds me of a comment on that last episode comparing Star Wars fans and Metallica fans. Somebody in the comments was upset at all the people saying new Metallica sucks. It's like all these old heads crapping on the new bands. And according to this person, is the reason why pop and hip hop is dominating. And I just, I don't see that. Like you said, metal is at the best place it's ever been in many respects. I don't see metal ever beating rap and pop in some sort of war. And I don't think that I want it to. I, I definitely want, I find myself in this odd position of defending bands like Bad Omens and Sleep Token because they get super popular and metalheads hate on them. And I want bands to be able to make the music that they want to make. I want them to make new and exciting stuff. But I don't really like that. I listen to extreme music. I listen to death metal because if I wanted to listen to soft music, pop already exists. So I find myself in this strange place where I want metal to be successful, more successful than it is, so that the bands that I like can make money and continue to make the art that I like. But on the other hand, I don't want my metal to be pop. So I'm not like that guy. I don't want metal to win this war on
Mm,
whatever other genre of music, country music or whatever.
mm.
That's a weird tension between I like being in the underground, I like being a part of this subset of society,
Yeah.
but I want everybody to be successful too.
Yeah, right. And this is so, and it's so that is such that's a classic tension that you're talking about. Like in the scholarship in metal studies, this comes up over and over again. This some fans who would like a la Manowar for metal to rule the world, to like to dominate all of popular music. And then there are other fans who really love that it's a special thing that nobody else knows about and it's private in a way, and it's secret.
Yeah, I don't have
And
to worry about normies being at the Septic Flesh show.
right, because you don't because part of the reason that we like this music was to get away from that to begin with, perhaps. I think lots of people certainly say things like that. But this because I really feel this tension too, like I love being part of an extreme metal scene and going to small shows. I like shows where there's like 25 to 50 people. I think those shows are great because it's low key. You can do whatever you want, really. Like at the last gig that I went to, tiny little grindcore show, and one of the bands, the singer takes his mic all the way to the door of the venue, opens the door, and is like screaming out into the street, which is so cool. And you can't get that at a big gig. You can't, because the performers are inframed by the stage, you know, that they and literally by the scale of the place. But on the other hand, of course, I want metal bands to do well and be successful and to influence culture because I think that it's an important and an interesting and vital culture. So yeah, I really grasp that. I think the problem is there isn't a way out of this contradiction.
Right.
That's the thing to grasp is that like metal's as long as metal's been around, it's been phasing in and out of popularity, a few years here and a few years off, and then now it's coming up in this other form, and now it's going away again because some other rock form or whatever has displaced it. And we're never gonna get, I think we're never gonna get a proper resolution to this because the forms of metal that become popular tend to be the kind of thing that extreme metal fans don't like because it's too pop sounding, and as you said, like if I wanted to listen to soft calming music or fun tunes, I would listen to a different genre of music. I come to metal to be assaulted by noise, but noise in a very controlled and powerful sense. Maybe that's just our position as like participants in extreme metal scenes. But I think the other thing to always to balance that with is that, you know, if it weren't for you watching Metallica on MTV in 1990 or whenever it was, you would have never got to the position that you are now. And the same thing goes for me. Like if I'd never listened to Slipknot on TV in about 2008, I don't think I'd be here right now. So the thing about these moments of popularity is that like we shouldn't be like, oh, this is terrible, you know, this is going to destroy the scene. But I also disagree with the opinion you mentioned earlier that boomers complaining that new Metallica isn't true Metallica is the thing that causes other genres to be bigger. I think what we've got to do is take our lumps and accept that when bands get popular and break into the scene, not for everybody, but for some people, that's going to be the thing that leads them to doing their own band, to finding out about more extreme shit and getting further into the heart of the scene.
Yeah, I don't know what that tipping point is because I don't
Mm.
gatekeeping, right? People say don't gatekeep, you're keeping people out of the scene. I'm sure that's true to an extent, but I don't know how true that is because what when I first heard that machine gun riff, that was it. It was over for me.
Mm.
I need more of that. And nothing anybody told me. I mean, my family was telling me I was going to hell for listening to that. So if some
Right.
other metalheads like that's not real metal, I'm like, well, okay, for you. I, but I'm sure it does happen. I'm sure, especially it's probably easier for me because I'm a man. I'm
Yeah.
sure gatekeeping does keep some people out of the scene, but I don't think it's as much as people say it is.
No, I agree. I think it's a internet phantom, frankly. I think a lot of it is urban myth, and it's also a convenient enemy for lots of people on the internet, you know. For the true for the extreme metal fan, it's a convenient they're a convenient person to point to and say this is why the scene isn't doing as well as I think it's doing. And for the fan of pop music who is maybe trying to enter metal spaces, it's a convenient enemy for them to kind of point at and say, well, they're bad and we're not like that. We're accepting and we listen to everything. So I think this figure is like a convenient foil or like a wrestling heel almost, like the villain of the piece.
Yeah.
And we need a villain so much to make our stories make sense. So I think it's a little bit overstated through social media because in my own experiences of being part of metal scenes, that's not normally how people talk to each other about bands.
Yeah.
Normally,
Not
in
in
my
person.
experience, no, not in person. That's the point. And in my experiences in person, it's normally more about, oh, well, I don't really like that, but have you tried this?
Mm.
And it's actually, which is actually polite enough, that's not going to dissuade somebody from being in the scene. Though I've obviously, as you also mentioned, like I'm obviously speaking from a biased position, and a lot of the metalheads that I've hung around with are also, like me, music nerds, and people that listen very broadly and consider themselves, middle class intellectuals like I am, So that's a caveat, but I think, yeah, gatekeeping is a little bit overstated compared to what it's actually like.
Yeah, yeah. If somebody really love, because metal is love. People love metal. I don't know anybody that's like, yeah, it's all right. They don't listen to it or they love it.
Yeah,
So
you either love it or you hate it. It's
yeah, so
very
I
divisive.
I don't see some dude going, that band sucks, and you go, oh, I guess I don't like metal anymore because of that negative experience. I don't think that really happens. And, and also, there's a big difference between if you tweet something and somebody replies, bro, that band sucks, and it's in text, that band sucks. And you're at
Mm.
a concert, and you talk about a band, and you hear somebody go, bro, that band sucks. It's a totally different vibe because text doesn't convey tone of voice.
Doesn't convey tone, but it also does something else. It lingers. This is what I was saying before about like all of these forum arguments like building up, and we get to see over time how our own reception of bands or albums changes. Like the thing about the internet is that the stuff on there stays forever, or until the website gets taken down, but a lot longer than a conversation lasts for us. Conversations are in the moment or as a memory, you know, and and given that people make sense of history backwards, this is a point from Hegel, is that we only make sense of the past retroactively. We don't make sense of things fully in the moment. It's only retrospectively that we fully in our narratives anyway, that we fully understand something. The fact that all of this information just sticks around forever, it means that like the figures like the gatekeeper, how, to what extent fictional or not, these stick around in people's imaginations a lot more than perhaps they used to.
Mm. Well, I think that'll bring us back to the point. I wonder, that's because that's a great point. It makes me think about what we talked about earlier. Like when a kid nowadays gets in the metal and looks on the internet, the liturgy for being a metal fan is now written and available. So I wonder if this nostalgia and these throwback bands is a result of all the the stuff that gets tired, enough time passing by. So for instance,
Mm.
glam, lots of big, crazy guitar solos. And that sort of got tired. And so in the 90s, bands stopped doing those big, crazy guitar solos. And they were like, nah, that's obnoxious. We don't do that anymore. And enough time passed, it's not tired anymore. Same thing I think is happening with Gent. Between 2015 and 2020, a lot of copycat bands. And now Gent is kind of a little bit tired. So bands are avoiding that. That's become sort of a thing. We're not going to do that until it gets old enough to not be tired anymore. And then it'll come
Mm.
back around in another nostalgia circle.
Yeah, and I really agree with that. The interesting thing to note there, perhaps, is that the features that persist are the ones that have to do with audience participation. Like the breakdown hasn't gone anywhere yet.
Yeah.
In fact, it's just getting more and more doubled down on. Like you listen to like modern deathcore, and they're just trying to wring every drop out of this musical feature, trying to like push it to the fucking limit.
Mm.
And that's because still move around to it. People dance to it. Solos are for watching and listening to. You can't dance to shredding in the same way. So those will fade in and out of popularity. Whereas I think the things that encourage dancing, they'll never go anywhere. The from thrash and death era, you, like a lot of the shredding and soloing has gone, but the idea of, oh, let's just play a D beat and get people to run around in a circle, that's still like such a core part of how modern extreme metal songs are written. I think the thing overall though is that like it is kind of dispiriting to realize that we're sort of trapped in these never-ending circles of nostalgia that we're never going that in some sense it feels like cultural history just keeps repeating itself over and over again in slightly different forms, and that now metal's nearly 60. We're stepping over the 55-year mark this year. Now that we're here, doesn't it? It does seem a little bit, I don't know. It's a little bit disillusioning to realize that like this may just keep going on, and maybe it's not as innovative as it has been.
Yeah.
I don't know what you think about
Yeah. I think we're in this nostalgia cycle right now, and we're going to have to wait 5, 10 years for another innovative wave to come. When Gent first hit, like that was hot. That's what all the guitar players are going to do now is this new exciting thing. And then, of course, it got tired and people are moving away from it or just being less obnoxious about it. They still gent like Spirit Box gents, but it's more incorporated into the song. It's not so
that.
it's not genting for genting's sake.
Yeah, and Sleep Token's kind of similar to that too. And I guess like the innovation that we're seeing this time around in metal as metal becomes popular on one level is this kind of fusing of softer genre styles. I think we talked about this last time, but softer genre styles with metal. So like taking R&B and pop, and there are other like electronic pop artists. Like there's this one called Poppy,
Mm.
who and she's also kind of binding industrial pop and stuff to metal. So on the one hand, that's a real like innovation in terms of songwriting, but the other innovation is all to do with the tech and like just the how hyper compressed we can now make a breakdown and how much detail we can get out of a vocal recording and paying more I guess the other thing this time around is paying lots and lots of attention to how the vocals sound, because a few years ago um it there was a paper that came out which pointed out that basically we've kind of got to the limit for how loud we can make guitars
Yeah.
without it descending into just formless noise. And since then, in commercially successful metal, even the stuff that's trying to be very extreme, there's been more and more attention paid to like, okay, well, the guitars are as loud as we can make them, and the drums are kind of as loud as we can make them. Can we make the vocals louder now? And that's why I think you've got this emphasis on virtuosos like Will Ramos from Lorna Shore, like people that can pull off like a huge range of different screams, because that's where the current excitement around virtuosity is happening in metal music.
Yeah. Who can make the weirdest animal noises? So,
Yep.
so like Alex Terrible did the Gator a couple of
Yes.
singles ago.
Right.
And it's interesting too because the old like virtuoso singing style, like the Iron Maidens, the Dream Theaters, that sort of really top tier vocalist style is sort of dated now. So,
Mm.
you know, now you've got the Will Ramoses and the Alex Terribles of the world that don't have that. It's a new sound, but they're still expressing that. Uh, I don't know what the word for virtuosity is, the best word, I guess, because they have uncanny abilities and control.
And we're really impressed by it, or the fans are really impressed by that. You know, like if you flick through comments on under Lorna Shore or similar kinds of videos, people are talking about, wow, it's these noises that he's making that's kind of the key thing to the song. And people aren't talking as much about, oh wow, the riff's really good here, the drumming's really good here. It's
No,
the it's
that's because Lorna Shore is the In Flames riff at 300 BPM.
Oh, sure, sure. And people point out perhaps indeed that it is maybe it's predictable over there, but in the region of the and I one must imagine in the 70s or 80s people were listening to like hair metal records and think, God, the drums and bass aren't doing very much, are they? And it's you know they're just playing chords so that they can give enough space to this guitarist to go up and down and do two finger tapping or whatever. Uh, whereas now the impressive thing and the thing that the other instruments need to get out of the way of is the vocals, because that's probably I say it's probably the area that's still the least developed in terms of virtuosity up until this point. Because like you look at like how good drummers and guitarists had to
Oh yeah.
get following, especially after death metal, like the level of how technical you have to be has gone up so much. I've been writing about this and I'm doing my literature review at the moment. It's been on my mind. But yeah, maybe now it's the vocals, because the other thing is like you can't just add more instruments in, because I think one of the central parts of the listening experience to metal is hearing something that is difficult or that sounds difficult to do. Um, and you can't just put more and more like keyboards or other melodic instruments in there, but making weird gurgly noises sounds difficult. It sounds like a hard thing to do. And I think maybe that's the focus, because we're still very impressed by that.
That gives me something to think about because like one of the points I made on my recent Knocked Loose episode was I think one of the reasons why they're so popular is because of dude's voice. You know, I can't sing along to Lorna Shore in the car. I don't
No,
have that ability. But a Knocked Loose song, I can just scream at the top of my lungs. Now my voice isn't high like his, so I can't sound like him, but I can still sing along.
this is another small room, big room thing, I guess, is
Hmm.
that like big room music is about the virtuoso to some extent. It's about showing off. You know, I've got this amazing talent that nobody else can do, basically, and you will pay money to come and see me do this incredible thing. Whereas small room music is more about the idea that anyone can play guitar,
Yeah, we're all a part of this scene.
and that anybody could do it.
Yeah.
I like to say to people for the gigs I'm doing with my current band is that I know that not everybody feels like they can sing, but everybody can scream. Everyone can scream. Not well, and not and not necessarily, and people might, you know, there is obviously people can hurt themselves if they don't if they don't sort themselves out with their diaphragm properly. But everybody can make horrible noises. We've all done it, either as babies or in many other situations. But that's a kind of universalizing thing. It brings the audience closer to the performer, that kind of rhetoric. Whereas the idea that there's a virtuoso implies that the audience are standing below the metal god, you know, this person with this uncanny talent.
I wonder if that's the reason. So let's try to summarize.
Yeah.
So, you know, I called you because I'm wondering why everything's old is new again. And maybe that's the reason. Maybe it's this wanting to go back to a scene, everybody can do it. And also you touched on the idea that it's a known quantity. Hardcore is a known quantity. I never in a million years would have thought that hardcore would become so popular that it's at Coachella and, pop festival attendees would know the words.
Mm.
And out of all the metal genres, I wouldn't have picked hardcore to be that one. But for some reason, it is. And maybe it's that earth tone, go to the ale store, part of the scene, anger at the current moment, known quantity, desires from the audience.
I think the reason that hardcore's doing well right now is because on the one hand it fits them, as you say, it does actually fit the moment. It's been a shit few years, and people have been politically activated over the last 10. So punk has a real relevance now that it really didn't have 10, 15 years ago. And you go back and look at the metalcore that was popular 10, 15, 20 years ago, and it's all based on pop punk. It barely mentions politics. It's all about it's more high schooly back then,
Yeah.
because questions of politics weren't so like close. But on the other hand, I think the other side to it is, yeah, like we live in a culture that is increasingly feeling fake. AI, social media interactions. It seems like no, it seems like when we do try to affect political change, it doesn't go the way we want it, or it doesn't seem to matter what we do a lot of the time. Hardcore feels real. It has this small room feeling. Even when they're playing at a very big stage like Coachella, there's still this feeling that this is somehow more about an authentic communitas where the performer and the audience are close together and can co-mingle, not like the sort of not how pop is currently presented, where not only are the stage shows incredibly elaborate, but also there's so much like playing in chart pop music with the idea that everything is artificial and fake, and that for a certain kind of fan is not interesting, and
Mm.
they want to have the experience of something real, of something punkish, even if they're experiencing it at an arena setting.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. So before we close, you mentioned your band, Absent Signifier, and this is a novel concept to me. Free metal. Why don't,
Cool.
why don't you
Okay.
why don't you tell me
Thanks.
about that real quick before we
I'll
go?
I'll plug it real quick. The touchstone for this band are the groups that a guy called John Zorn did in the early 1990s called Naked City and Painkiller. And Zorn is an avant-garde jazz composer, and he collected a group of hardcore and metal musicians to do these kind of half jazz, half rock, half grindcore albums. And so he's our biggest like inspiration. What we do, what free metal is controlled improvisations using metal genres. So like we'll have like a bit that sounds like a doom song. Then we'll move to like a black metal blast. Then because we're in that style, maybe we'll decide, oh, this is good. Let's do a bit of a black thrash or like early death metal bit. Um, but it's all done through hand gestures. So the different sides of the clock face, as it were, those represent four different times, like speeds. Um, and then we've got signals for playing it loose or playing it tight. So we have this whole vocabulary that we use while we're playing to tell each other what we're going to do next. Um, and it also gets a little bit more complicated than that. But the thing to take away from it is that it still sounds like your average two-piece grindcore or sludge band, in that it sounds fucking awful and it's very, very loud.
So are you improving every show, or do you have sort of like an arsenal of riffs that you go to and then you signal each other?
Depends on the song and the show. We think about who our audience is likely to be depending on where we get booked. We played 6 gigs so far. We're playing another one tomorrow, and it's a Doom kind of audience. So we're gonna try. This doesn't always work, but we're gonna try and keep it slow and psych, like let it jam out a bit rather than trying to pull the rug up out from under the audience and decide to just blast for 2 or 3 minutes. Um, but yeah, we do that. And some songs have like a head. Jazz songs have like a main melody that they keep coming back to, and in between you'll have solos. So we have for some songs that we've got that kind of strategy, but for other songs it's more complicated and more free.
Mm. I find that interesting because you free is such an interesting word because yeah, you can just do whatever you want. But outside of those constraints, you, so for instance, I think it would probably be difficult for you to have two other guitar players doing what you all
Very,
do. Yeah,
very.
because you have to work with each other. So in a
And
way, you're kind of not free.
very good. I think you're totally right. Like, we are so vulnerable on stage because it's just two of us. I'm playing bass and singing, and as a drummer. And if either of us stop, the whole thing falls apart. And we have to watch each other the whole time. So in a way, you're right. Like we're not free. We have to like maintain such like close contact while we play. And we also like we're relying on the other to understand us. We're like it's not total individuated freedom. It's the freedom of having to build something together. And yeah, that in one sense it is like we could go anywhere we want, but we also wherever we go, the other person has to come with us, or we have to go, or I have to go with them. Um, Eventually, I want to have a guitarist. Eventually, but to get there, I want to do something with like tech. So I want to have like screens, like Android tablets, basically that would have our set on them as like a slide deck or something similar to that, where you've got like a bunch of slides with musical information on them, and those will be connected to some foot switches. Each member will have some foot switches for them, so we can all like vote to move through these together, and that will mean that we
Whoa.
don't have to look at each other. That will mean that we don't have to stare at each other. So then we could have a guitarist because then and as many people as I wanted. But
Mm.
that's a couple of that might be a year or two away because we've got to get all the stuff together and design it and maybe get a programmer to give us a hand and that kind of thing. Um,
Wow,
but it would
that's a
be
super novel
extraordinarily difficult
concept.
to do that.
And no
It's
show is ever
again,
going to
it's
be the
it's
same.
actually based. That's right. Never the same twice. But also in a way, always the same because it always currently it sounds like two people beating the shit out of their instruments. Um, and I'm not very good. I'm actually not a very good bass player. Like I'm not a shredder at all. Like I'm okay, but like I'm not a shredder. So there are loads of like wrong chords in the mix all the time. Like the riffs are, as I say, they're often made up, so they're not like the best riffs you've ever heard. But we always get people coming up to us after our gigs saying, "I have never heard anything like that before," and
Yeah.
that's good.
And what about the lyrics? Do you make those up on the spot or do you have like,
Yeah, yeah. I
that's
improvise lyrics as
crazy,
well.
dude.
Often
I,
I complain. I will complain. The most common theme in my lyrics is complaining about having to be a performing artist. It's like talking about how it sucks that I'm on stage. Why are you here? Go home.
yeah, I can get on this microphone and just ramble about whatever subject's on my mind pretty easily, but putting it musically, that seems awfully challenging.
Yeah, it depends on the well, yeah. One of my mates after an early gig said you should just lean into it further. Just keep leaning into that impulse, because it was like I wasn't quite sure if I was ready to commit. So like imagine it's kind of again another big hero is Mike Patton from Faith No More, Mr. Bungle, and like the way he leans into acting like an insane person on stage, and the way he delivers his vocal, that's a big jumping off point as well. Like just enjoying the psychosis of it.
Mm. Well, that's a good point to end on, because going back to nostalgia, Ben McKenty got into a bit of hot water because he tweeted the reason why metal's not on top of the world is because it's just riffs now, and all the players look like baristas. There's no over the top personalities like Fred Durst. It's still weird to me that he chose Fred Durst to make his point, but there's no more Axl Roses. I guess Ronnie Radke's is doing it now, but
He's
lean
probably the
into
biggest
it.
one.
Yeah, be that guy. And I'm not saying you should be Axl Rose, but
I agree.
this thing that you're doing, do it. Go all the way.
Thanks, man. Really appreciate that. It was great to talk to you again. Like, this was great.
Yeah, man, thank you so much for helping me out with this. And it's Absent Signifier. I will have all of y'all's information in the description. Also, your drummer wrote the book on death metal. They literally wrote the book on death metal. So y'all get the book.
Indeed.
Tom Coles. Check out Absent Signifier.
Get the book.
David Burke. Thank you.
Safe. Thank you very much.